The descent onto Zerich 3 felt like entering another dimension. Commander Eli Thorne watched from the cockpit as the thick blue clouds parted, revealing the vast, iridescent landscapes below. Zerich 3 was nothing like the reports, nothing like he had imagined. The surface seemed to shimmer, like the planet itself was alive, pulsing with colors that shifted from violet to green under the light of the twin suns. Eli's breath caught as the ship glided closer to the surface, the sprawling vistas of crystalline forests and glowing rivers revealing themselves in more detail. The landing thrusters hummed, cutting through the gentle hiss of Zerich's atmosphere as the ship settled onto a clearing in the crystalline forest. He took a deep breath, steadied himself, and pressed the release on the ship's hatch. The air outside was cooler than expected, carrying a faintly metallic tang that Eli found both invigorating and unsettling. As he stepped onto the surface, he felt the ground beneath him give slightly, almost as though it were responding to his presence. The landscape around him was even more magnificent up close. The flora here didn't resemble plants as much as translucent, upright crystal structures that branched and twisted into intricate, web-like patterns. Glowing from within, they cast a soft, almost hypnotic light across the clearing. He glanced back at his ship, and then ahead toward the path leading through the crystalline forest. It was here that he was to meet Leah, the Zerixian liaison assigned to him. Leah would be his guide, his translator, and in a way his key to understanding this enigmatic world. He recalled the briefing Zerich 3 was the home of the Zerixians, a reclusive alien race known for their intellectual curiosity and nuanced understanding of organic symbiosis. They had evolved with an intricate bond to their environment, one that Eli would have to understand if he were to complete his mission successfully. He checked his gear one last time before taking his first steps down the winding, narrow path. Each step echoed faintly, his boots landing on the crystalline ground with a soft chime, like distant wind chimes on Earth. This planet was nothing if not eerie. Suddenly, a soft rustle sounded from up ahead, and he stopped, hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. A figure emerged from the trees, moving gracefully between the columns of crystal. She was tall, with skin that glistened under the strange light, a soft shade of silver with hints of blue and violet, a hue that seemed to change as she moved. Her eyes were wide, almost glowing, and her hair, which cascaded down her back, had the fluidity of water yet the solidity of metal. This must be Leah. Commander Thorne, she greeted him, her voice carrying a musical quality. It resonated in the air, as though it had traveled directly from her thoughts to his mind. Zerixians had mastered the art of telepathic communication, though she seemed to be speaking aloud out of courtesy for him. Leah, he replied, adjusting to the strange resonance of her voice. It's an honor to finally meet you. She tilted her head, studying him with an expression that was almost a smile. Those Zerixian expressions were as complex and multi-layered as their language. Her eyes narrowed slightly as though she were analyzing every movement, every shift in his tone. Your presence here is of great importance to us, she said, her words conveying a calm yet palpable intensity. The Council awaits your insights, but first, it is our custom to show our guests the essence of our world, so you may understand us before speaking of alliances. Eli nodded, intrigued. Leah gestured for him to follow, and they continued down the path. Her steps were nearly silent, blending seamlessly with the rhythmic hum of the crystalline forest. As they walked, he noticed the forest seemed to respond to her presence. The colors shifted around her, pulsing brighter wherever her hand brushed against the delicate crystal branches. This symbiosis, Eli said, nodding toward the crystals, is unlike anything I've seen. It's as if the world itself is alive, connected to you. Leah stopped, placing her hand on a nearby crystal, her expression softening as it emitted a faint glow in response. In a way it is. Zerich 3 is not just our home, it is part of us, and we are part of it. Each of us forms a bond with the world around us from the moment we are born. To you, these are mere structures, but to us they are memories, connections, life itself. Eli watched her, captivated by the quiet reverence in her voice. He was beginning to understand that the Zerixians viewed their world not as a resource to be used, but as an extension of their own consciousness. This perspective was something he had only encountered in fragments during his studies, but seeing it, feeling it firsthand, was overwhelming. The path ended at a clearing where a broad, glistening lake lay nestled between towering crystal formations. The water was clear, but as it caught the light of the setting suns, it refracted, scattering hues of indigo, teal, and rose across the surrounding landscape. Leah led him to the edge of the lake, gesturing for him to kneel beside her. As he did, she extended her hand toward the water, and a ripple spread out from her touch, sending colors shimmering across the surface. "We are bound to this world, to its essence," she explained, dipping her hand deeper into the water. "But these bonds are not just biological. They are emotional, spiritual. What you see before you is our memory pool. It holds fragments of every Zerixian who has walked this land. If you are to understand us, you must experience it." Eli looked at her, unsure if he fully understood what she was offering, but he felt an undeniable urge to learn. He reached out and touched the water beside her. As his hand made contact, a jolt of sensation shot through him, and for a brief moment, his vision blurred. He gasped as vision scenes from lives he hadn't lived filled his mind. He saw the lush landscapes of Zerich 3 from different perspectives, felt the weight of generations, the love, loss, and quiet resilience of the Zerixians. It was as if he had tapped into a well of collective experience, a tapestry of emotions that left him breathless. When he finally withdrew his hand, he felt as though a part of him had been forever altered. Leah was watching him intently, her expression softening in a way that suggested approval. "You felt it, didn't you? Our memories, our connection to this world." He nodded, still trying to process the flood of sensations. "It's overwhelming. Beautiful. I've never felt anything like it." "That is why we wanted you here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "To understand us is to understand our bond to this place. If our worlds are to work together, it must be through understanding and respect." Eli felt a surge of determination as he met her gaze, seeing the hope reflected in her violet eyes. He understood now that the stakes were higher than he had imagined. This wasn't just about resources or alliances, it was about safeguarding something delicate, something precious. He knew then that he would do whatever it took to protect this world and its people. As they rose to their feet, the soft light of the twin suns bathed the landscape in warm tones, casting their shadows onto the shimmering crystal formations around them. Leah led him back through the forest, her movements graceful and fluid. With every step, Eli felt the weight of his purpose solidify within him, grounded by the newfound understanding he had gained from the memory pool. Reaching the edge of the clearing near his ship, Leah turned to him, a faint, enigmatic smile on her face. "We look forward to what you bring to our council." And she added, her voice soft, "to what you may discover within yourself." Eli felt an unspoken promise between them as he returned her smile. The first days with Kayla on Zerich 3 were a whirlwind of adjustment, fascination, and an undercurrent of tension that neither of them fully acknowledged. Kayla was more than a liaison, she was an embodiment of Zerixian culture, carrying with her the planet's unique customs, perspectives, and an intricate emotional restraint that baffled and intrigued Eli in equal measure. She moved through their shared space with a fluid grace, her tall, silver-hued form almost blending with the luminous crystals of the landscape visible through the transparent walls of their quarters. Her presence was a constant reminder that he was the outsider here, a visitor learning to coexist in a world as alien to him as he must have been to her. Their quarters were modest but meticulously arranged, following the Zerixian design philosophy. The walls were smooth and semi-transparent, allowing light from the luminescent plants outside to filter in. There was a curious lack of furniture that Eli had been used to: no chairs, tables, or beds in the traditional sense. Instead, the floor was layered with soft, reactive panels that adjusted to body weight and temperature, forming seats, lounges, or even makeshift beds depending on need. Kayla used these intuitively, moving from one form to another with seamless ease, while Eli found himself continually trying to adjust, his human habits awkwardly clashing with the organic elegance of the Zerixian environment. Their routine settled into a rhythm, albeit a slightly awkward one. Kayla was quiet, and her interactions often felt guarded. Eli couldn't tell if this was cultural or personal, but he assumed it was both. Her face remained a mask of calm, and her eyes, though observant, betrayed little of what she felt. Each morning, she would walk into the kitchen area and quietly prepare a mix of plant-based substances native to Zerich 3, which she would drink with an efficiency that left Eli bewildered. She made no small talk, her every action marked by a purposeful silence that he found both serene and unnerving. He tried, at first, to make small talk, to bridge the gap between them with the light banter he was accustomed to. However, Kayla's responses were brief, devoid of the warmth or reciprocation he was used to. She responded politely but never elaborated, her words often veiled in the formal language typical of her people. One morning, in a moment of curiosity, he asked her about her view of the concept of breakfast as a social ritual. She looked at him thoughtfully before replying. To Zerichians, the act of sustenance is solitary, introspective. It allows us to honor our connection to the energy of our environment. Why would we dilute such a moment with unnecessary exchanges? Her words left him at a loss. It was clear that the idea of sharing meals as a form of bonding held no inherent value in her culture. Yet, he was determined to build a bridge. "I understand," he said carefully. "But in human culture, eating together isn't about the food as much as it is about connection. We bond over shared experiences." Like meals, she regarded him with an almost clinical curiosity before offering a nod of acknowledgement. "Perhaps in time," she said softly, "we will find a middle ground." Even with her formal and guarded demeanor, he began to notice the little things. Kayla had an almost imperceptible habit of tilting her head when listening, and her eyes would shift to a darker shade of violet when she was contemplating something deeply. The first time he caught this change in her eyes, it fascinated him. The Zerichians seemed to carry their emotions in subtle, visual cues, a stark contrast to the human tendency to express themselves through words and gestures. It became a personal challenge for Eli to learn her patterns, to decode the quiet language of her glances, her shifts in posture, and the faint glow in her hair that flickered with hints of color, depending on her mood. One evening, as they were both settling into the common area, he dared to ask her about the process. "Kayla, your presence changes colors. It's mesmerizing. Does each color mean something specific?" She hesitated, her gaze turning thoughtful as if weighing whether to share this aspect of herself. "Our colors," she began slowly, "are indeed a language, one that communicates emotions not typically spoken aloud. Violet, for instance, signals contemplation or deep thought. Silver is neutrality, which you see most often. Blue represents tranquility, and gold, well, gold is rarely seen. It indicates joy or profound connection, emotions not commonly displayed." Eli sensed that this openness was rare for her and decided to press his curiosity gently. "And how does one earn a glimpse of the elusive gold?" Kayla's expression softened, a faint glimmer of amusement in her eyes. "It is not something one earns," she replied. "It is a resonance of feeling, a state that comes naturally if it is meant to be." Her eyes held his, and for a brief moment the space between them felt charged, an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. Despite their differences, Kayla's presence became something Eli looked forward to, though he couldn't quite explain why. Each day brought new glimpses into the intricacies of Zerichian culture. He watched as she engaged in nightly rituals that involved placing her hands on the walls of their quarters, her eyes closed, as though communing with the very essence of the planet. One evening he finally worked up the nerve to ask her about it. "This practice," he said, indicating her hands on the wall, "is it a form of meditation?" She turned to him, her gaze calm but intense. "In a way, yes, it is our way of aligning ourselves with Zerich's 3. Each evening we renew our bond with the planet, allowing it to refresh our energy. You may call it meditation, but it is more than that. It is a communion with the living memory of our ancestors and the land itself." Intrigued, Eli asked if he could try it. She studied him for a long moment before giving a small nod. Placing his hand on the cool surface of the wall beside her, he felt a subtle pulse, a faint hum that traveled up his arm and seemed to resonate with his heartbeat. It was as though he had briefly tapped into a shared consciousness, an awareness of the planet and its inhabitants. When he pulled his hand away, his skin tingled, and he looked at Kayla with newfound respect. She had shared a piece of her world with him, allowing him into a sacred space. Despite these moments of connection, there was a boundary between them that neither seemed willing to cross. The cultural gulf loomed large, and Eli felt the weight of it in every conversation. However, there were instances when she would look at him, her eyes softer, her expression less guarded, and he sensed that she was struggling with her own boundaries. It was on one such evening that the conversation took an unexpected turn. They were discussing human concepts of family and love, ideas that seemed as foreign to her as the Zerixian rituals were to him. She listened intently, her head tilted as he spoke of human relationships, the bonds of love and family that tied people together. When he finished, she was quiet, her gaze distant. Humanity's concept of love is intense, she said finally. It seems almost reckless, yet beautiful in its own way. In Zerixian culture, we do not form bonds based on attachment. Our alliances are logical, practical, designed to benefit the collective. Eli looked at her, a sudden understanding dawning on him. You've never experienced love then? Not in the way humans do. She hesitated, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing her face. No, I have never felt what humans call love. For us, emotions are controlled, guided. Love, as you describe it, would be seen as a loss of control, a deviation from logic. They sat in silence, the weight of her words settling between them. He could feel the urge to reach out, to bridge the gap in a way that went beyond words, but he restrained himself. The boundaries were clear, and yet the desire to cross them lingered in the air. As days turned into weeks, Eli and Kayla's cohabitation evolved into a tenuous understanding. She continued her rituals, her silence, her guarded demeanor, but there was a warmth growing in their shared moments, a quiet companionship that he hadn't expected. One night, as they watched the shimmering crystals of the forest from their quarters, she turned to him, her face illuminated by the gentle glow. Commander Thorne, she said softly, you have shown me a side of humanity that I did not expect to encounter. Your curiosity, your willingness to adapt, it is admirable. Eli felt a warmth spread through him, touched by her rare admission. I could say the same about you, Kayla. You've been patient with my human quirks, with my need to understand and analyze. I think we're learning from each other, even if our ways are different. She regarded him for a long moment, and in the dim light, he thought he saw a flicker of gold in her hair. It was fleeting, but it made his heart race. Perhaps, he thought, they were bridging the gap, one small step at a time. In that quiet night, as they sat side by side, Eli felt the potential of something more, a connection that went beyond species and culture. And while neither of them spoke of it, both understood that this was only the beginning of an extraordinary journey. The shift was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. It began with a glance here, a shared silence there, each moment holding a new weight that both Eli and Kayla could feel, but neither could name. They had fallen into a routine, but it wasn't the kind of monotonous rhythm that dulled over time. Instead, it was a steady cadence, each day revealing a different facet of their cohabitation, a new way they were learning to exist within each other's worlds. As the days blurred together, their interactions began to take on a life of their own, and Eli found himself looking forward to each shared moment with Kayla. Kayla was still reserved, her demeanor almost impeccably calm, but he began to notice the smallest gestures that spoke to a growing familiarity between them. She would occasionally turn her head to watch him when she thought he wasn't looking, her violet eyes softening, holding an uncharacteristic warmth. Once, she even asked him to share stories of his home, a request that took him by surprise. He described Earth, its vast oceans, sprawling cities, and sunrises that painted the skies with gold and rose. Her questions were precise, almost clinical, yet there was an undertone of fascination in her voice. The oceans on your planet, she murmured one evening as he spoke of his favorite coastal views. They sound immense, a world contained within a world forever in motion. We have no such thing here. Eli nodded, leaning against the frame of their quarters viewing window, gazing at her as she looked out into the dark expanse of the Zerixian forest. The ocean feels a bit like space itself sometimes. Vast, endless, dangerous even. And yet there's a beauty to it. It's alive in a way that defies reason. Maybe. Maybe like the forest here, he added, noting how the iridescent foliage outside pulsed softly under the moonlight. Kayla's gaze lingered on the view, but her attention was clearly more on his words. I suppose you would call them alive. They respond to light, to temperature. They are interconnected, as if breathing together. She fell silent, and then, after a long pause, admitted, I have not thought of it that way before. Eli realized that in her reserved way, Kayla was opening up, however guardedly. Perhaps it was simply the result of living together or a curiosity that went beyond mere observation. Either way, he saw it as the beginnings of something deeper, small but significant moments where the barrier between them seemed to dissolve just a little, leaving them on the precipice of something more than companionship. And as those small moments accumulated, so did Eli's awareness of her presence in a way that unsettled him. He found himself noticing details that should have been trivial but, for reasons he couldn't explain, lingered in his thoughts. He watched her hands as she performed daily tasks, graceful and precise, her silver skin shimmering under the light. He noticed the gentle ripple of color that would occasionally flicker in her hair, telling him more about her emotions than her expression ever could. When she was focused or curious, her hair glowed a faint purple. When she was at ease, it settled into a soft silver. And every so often he glimpsed brief flashes of gold, the color that had become an enigma, one he was increasingly eager to unravel. One evening, as they prepared to watch a Zerichian documentary on interspecies cooperation, Kayla hesitated before sitting beside him on the floor cushion. She seemed to deliberate for a moment before speaking. Commander. She began, her voice steady, though he could sense a hint of tension beneath her words. I have been reflecting on our interactions. There are aspects of humanity that you bring into our shared space that intrigue me. Your warmth, I suppose, is one of them. It is an unfamiliar feeling for me. Her candidness startled him. Eli had grown accustomed to Kayla's composed nature, her emotions as reserved and contained as the stars in the distance. My warmth, he repeated, caught between curiosity and amusement. Yes, she confirmed, meeting his gaze directly, her violet eyes filled with a rare vulnerability. The Zerichian concept of interaction is built on purpose and necessity. What I see with humans, however, often seems extraneous, yet it appears to fulfill something essential. She paused, as if searching for the right words. It brings a certain comfort, something we don't prioritize. Comfort is important to us, Eli agreed softly. It's the reason we keep certain things close, the reason we seek out companionship even when it's not necessary. She nodded, her gaze distant, as if seeing something he couldn't. That is something I cannot fully comprehend. To us, unnecessary bonds are distractions, liabilities. But I see potential. I am beginning to understand why humans value it so. They were quiet for a moment, the soft glow from the Zerichian plant life outside casting faint shadows across the room. Eli could feel his heart beating faster, the silence between them charged in a way that had nothing to do with science or diplomacy. It was as though, without words, they had both recognized that something undefinable was beginning to grow between them, fragile but undeniable. You know, Eli said finally, breaking the silence, I think you're more human than you realize. We all have walls. It's just that, for us, they're a little easier to break. Maybe you don't need to keep yours up so tightly. Kayla's gaze softened, her head tilting as if she were contemplating his words. It is not that I wish to keep them up, she replied slowly, her voice lower, almost contemplative. It is simply that I am unused to letting anyone close. But I find myself wondering, Commander Thorne, what it would be like to share in the way you describe. Her voice held a quiet gravity, as though she were confessing something deeply personal. Eli's heart beat faster as he processed her words, his gaze never leaving hers. Kayla, he began, his voice almost a whisper. We don't have to rush anything. But I'll be here, for whatever you want to share. You don't have to hold back. She nodded, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. It was as if, in that single moment, she had made a silent decision, one that carried a weight he could feel but not yet understand. After that night, things changed between them in subtle ways. There were lingering glances, quiet gestures of closeness that felt like an unspoken promise. Their days followed the same rhythm, yet each interaction held a new warmth, a quiet intimacy that neither dared to address directly. They spoke of Earth, of Zerichian customs, of the vastness of space, but beneath each conversation, there was a growing awareness, a quiet certainty that they were no longer just colleagues or companions. One afternoon, as they walked together through the bioluminescent forests, Kayla stopped beside a rare flowering tree, its petals glowing a soft, luminous blue. She reached out to touch a petal, her hand delicate against the soft light. Eli watched her, captivated not only by the beauty of the tree but by the way she interacted with it, a gentleness in her movements that he hadn't noticed before. "This tree," she murmured, "is known as the Luria. It blooms once every cycle, and the flowers emit a frequency that to us represents harmony. I've come here many times, but I don't think I've ever truly appreciated its beauty." Eli moved closer, his gaze shifting from the tree to her. "It's incredible," he said softly, though his eyes were fixed on her, taking in the subtle changes in her expression, the way her hair glimmered with hints of violet and gold. Kayla looked at him, her eyes softening as she noticed his focus. "Perhaps it is you, Commander, who has shown me how to see this beauty. You see things differently." They stood there, close enough that he could feel her presence, the faint scent of the forest lingering between them. For a moment, time seemed to stand still, and Eli felt the unmistakable pull, a longing to close the distance between them, to bridge the gap that had separated their worlds. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers, a gentle, tentative touch that sent a rush of warmth through him. Kayla didn't pull away. Instead, she looked at him with an expression that spoke of 1,000 unspoken things, her eyes glimmering with a softness he had never seen before. "Kayla," he murmured, his voice barely audible. She held his gaze, her fingers tightening slightly around his as she took a breath, steadying herself. "Commander, I believe this is what humans might call a spark, a connection." "Yes," he replied, his voice filled with quiet wonder. "That's exactly what it is. And maybe it's worth exploring." Kayla nodded, her eyes never leaving his. "I am willing if you are. This closeness, though unfamiliar, does not feel wrong. In fact, it feels right." For a long moment they stood there, hands entwined, neither of them needing words to express the depth of what they felt. It was as though in that one gesture they had crossed a threshold, entering a new realm of understanding and connection that transcended their differences, their roles, and their cultures. As the light of the Luria flower bathed them in its soft glow, Eli felt a profound sense of peace, a certainty that this was only the beginning. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, their lives forever altered by the quiet spark that had ignited between them. And in that moment, standing in the heart of the Zerixian forest, surrounded by the luminous beauty of Kayla's world, he knew that they had discovered something rare, something precious, a bond that would endure, no matter where their journey led. As time passed, Eli and Kayla's interactions grew richer and more complex. Each day brought a new challenge to the cultural boundaries that separated them, pushing both to confront their deepest preconceptions. For Eli, these boundaries weren't just about customs or language, they were fundamental differences in how their species perceived connection, intimacy, and purpose. And for Kayla, breaking these boundaries meant questioning the core values she'd held all her life, the beliefs she'd been raised to see as absolute. One evening, after a quiet dinner, Eli noticed Kayla lingering at the edge of the balcony, her gaze fixed on the stars. He joined her, leaning on the railing beside her, feeling the chill of the night air mingling with the warmth radiating from her presence. Her face was calm, but he could sense an internal conflict that seemed to weigh heavily on her. "Kayla," he said softly, breaking the silence. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the railing. Her hair shifted from silver to faint streaks of purple, a color he'd come to recognize as a signal of curiosity tinged with uncertainty. "Eli," she began, her voice measured, "I've been thinking about the concept of vulnerability." Eli tilted his head, intrigued. Vulnerability was a term that came easily to humans, a natural element of connection. But for Kayla, whose culture revered control and emotional restraint, vulnerability held a different meaning, perhaps even a hint of shame. "You've mentioned before that Zerixians see vulnerability as a weakness," he said gently. "But I don't see it that way. For humans, being vulnerable with someone, it's a strength. It's how we show trust, how we let people in." Kayla's eyes shifted to him, her gaze piercing, as though searching for something beneath his words. "On Zerich 3, to expose one's inner self is to risk disruption, to introduce a factor of instability. Our society values harmony above all. I was raised to believe that emotions, especially those that might lead to attachment, were dangerous, something to be controlled, even suppressed." Eli felt a pang of sympathy as he listened. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to live in a world where connection was seen as a threat rather than a gift. Maybe. It's about balance, he offered. Vulnerability doesn't mean losing control. It's about finding a way to open up without losing yourself. Kayla nodded slowly, as though the concept was settling into place within her mind. Her gaze softened, and she took a step closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You've helped me see that, Eli. I'm beginning to understand what it means to share a part of myself without fear. It was a quiet confession, but Eli knew it carried profound significance. For her, even acknowledging this change was a monumental step, a breach in the barriers she had been taught to uphold. She was reaching for something unfamiliar, something uncharted and yet deeply desired. A breeze swept over the balcony, carrying the earthy scent of the Zerichian forest. Eli turned to Kayla, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and wonder. I think he said carefully that sharing this journey, exploring these new experiences together might be worth the risk. She glanced at him, her hair shimmering in soft shades of blue and violet, a reflection of her internal contemplation. After a long pause, she spoke again, her voice steadier but layered with uncharacteristic vulnerability. Eli, I want to know more. About you. About these emotions that drive humans so deeply. I want to understand what it feels like to trust, to care, to belong. The air between them grew charged, and Eli felt an inexplicable urge to bridge the space between them. His hand inched closer to hers, and when their fingers touched, he felt a rush of warmth, a quiet but powerful confirmation of the bond they were forming. Kayla's gaze flickered to their joined hands, her expression softened, her defenses slipping away. On Zerich's 3, physical contact like this. It's rare, reserved only for moments of significance. To touch is to acknowledge something more than mere acquaintance. It's a symbol of intent, of recognition. Eli's heart raced. Then, what does this mean, he asked, gently holding her gaze as his thumb brushed over her fingers. Kayla's voice dropped to a near whisper. It means, I'm willing to cross the boundary that separates us, Eli, to explore what lies beyond logic and necessity. I want to understand you. The words hung between them. A quiet revelation that carried an unspoken promise. In that moment, Eli knew that this was the turning point, the instant their relationship would shift from curiosity and tentative friendship to something deeper, something neither of them had fully anticipated. They stood together, hands entwined, each understanding that this simple touch marked the beginning of a shared journey into the unknown. They would continue to confront the boundaries that separated their worlds, but for now they had taken the first step together. And with each passing day, the barriers between them would grow fainter, fading under the quiet strength of their connection. The line between curiosity and connection had dissolved, leaving Eli and Kayla entangled in something neither of them had anticipated, an intimacy forbidden by the rigid protocols of her society on Zerich's 3. Their bond, tender and profound, was uncharted territory for Kayla, a Zerichian who had been raised to prioritize control over connection and caution over vulnerability. For Eli, this growing attachment felt as natural as breathing, but he knew he was treading on delicate ground. One evening, they sat on the balcony overlooking the luminous landscape of Zerich's 3. The shimmering vegetation cast an ethereal glow across the horizon, and in the soft silence, Eli could feel Kayla's presence more intensely than ever. Her hand rested next to his, fingers nearly touching, as they shared the quiet intimacy of the evening. Kayla's eyes, usually focused and calculating, held a softness he hadn't seen before. But despite this closeness, Eli could sense the tension brewing beneath the surface. Kayla finally broke the silence, her voice low and steady, yet tinged with uncertainty. Eli, if my people were to know about this connection we're forming, it would bring severe consequences. He looked at her, understanding the gravity of her words. Zerichian law was explicit. Relationships with outsiders, especially those involving emotional attachment, were seen as distractions, vulnerabilities that could weaken the unity of their society. For her, even being with him in this way was a risk. Kayla, he murmured, his tone both tender and earnest. I understand the risks, but is it worth denying what we feel just because it's forbidden? She met his gaze, her normally serene expression fraught with conflicting emotions. Her hair, which usually held the calm silver sheen typical of her kind, now glimmered with streaks of deep violet and blue, betraying her inner turmoil. In my world, Vulnerability is not only avoided but punished. Emotional connections are seen as a weakness, a deviation from our purpose. I would be stripped of my status, cast out, and seen as a danger to my own people. Her words hung heavy in the air, yet Eli could see the determination in her gaze, as if some part of her was willing to defy even her deepest ingrained beliefs. He reached out, gently taking her hand in his, and felt a quiet thrill when she didn't pull away. "We don't have to tell anyone," he said softly. "This can be ours alone, something they can't touch or take away from us." Kayla's expression softened, her fingers entwining with his, as she took a tentative step toward him. "But how long can we keep this hidden?" she asked, a trace of sadness in her voice. "Sooner or later they will come for me, and I will have to return to my duties, to the expectations of my people." Eli felt a pang of frustration. The idea of losing her, of watching her retreat into a world where connection was forbidden, was almost unbearable. What if? What if there was a way for you to stay? To challenge those expectations? Kayla looked away, her brow furrowing as she considered his words. Challenging our beliefs is more than forbidden, it's dangerous. To do so would mean not only exile for me, but possibly conflict for my people. Yet, with you, Eli, I am beginning to question everything I've been taught. You make me feel complete in ways I didn't know I was lacking. Her admission hung in the air between them, fragile and sincere. Eli's heart raced, knowing what a step this was for her. "You don't have to face this alone," he whispered, leaning closer. "I'll stand by you, no matter what it means." Kayla's gaze softened, her voice trembling slightly as she said, This connection we're building, it defies everything I've ever known. But I can't ignore it. I can't ignore you." Their faces were inches apart now, and Eli felt the quiet pull between them, a gentle gravity drawing them closer. It was an invitation, a moment suspended in time, where both of them understood the implications of stepping beyond the boundaries they had lived by. And then, as if the rest of the world had faded, she leaned forward, closing the distance between them in a delicate, almost hesitant kiss. The touch was brief, tentative, but it carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. Eli's hand found the side of her face, his thumb brushing lightly over her cheek as he deepened the kiss, feeling her respond with a vulnerability that went against everything she had been taught. When they finally pulled apart, Kayla's gaze held a newfound determination, though her voice remained soft. "No matter what happens, Eli, no matter the risks, I don't want to lose this. I don't want to lose you." In that moment, Eli knew that they had crossed a line, one they could never return from. They had chosen each other, even if it meant walking a path fraught with uncertainty and risk. And as they sat together in the quiet aftermath of their kiss, fingers entwined and hearts laid bare, they both understood that theirs was a bond that could not be broken, even by the strictest of laws. In the days that followed their quiet, fateful decision, Eli and Kayla found themselves in a strange and beautiful limbo. Every glance, every touch, and every shared moment carried a sense of anticipation, like they were standing on the edge of something vast and transformative. No longer bound by the rigid protocols of Zerichian society, Kayla's interactions with Eli began to shift, softening in a way that was new for her, for both of them. She had long practiced restraint, but now she allowed herself to smile more openly, to laugh freely. In the calm of the evening, she even found herself drawn to the simple pleasures Eli introduced her to, a strange, bittersweet concept she was coming to embrace with each new experience they shared. They spent their mornings exploring Zerich's 3's radiant landscapes, now with Kayla as Eli's willing companion rather than as his guide. Together, they ventured to crystalline forests that sparkled in the pale light, where Kayla explained the complex eco-cycles and unique flora of her world. But beyond the scientific details, her eyes would linger on his, warm and steady, as though he were as much a part of this strange, vibrant world as she was. The trust that had grown between them was palpable, grounding them amidst the surreal beauty around them. In one of these moments, standing on a cliff overlooking a valley awash with soft, otherworldly light, Kayla turned to Eli with an expression of resolve. Her fingers, usually so careful, so precise, reached out to grasp his hand with unexpected firmness. "I want you to know," she began, her voice low but unwavering, "that this choice, this life we're building together has given me something I never thought I'd have." She paused, her gaze drifting to the horizon before returning to him, her violet eyes shimmering with intensity. I was taught to believe that emotions were a distraction, a weakness. But now, they feel like the core of everything, like the purpose I never knew I was seeking. Eli, sensing the depth of her words, squeezed her hand, his own voice touched by the quiet gravity of the moment. Kayla, we're not just defying rules or stepping beyond borders. We're creating something new, something that belongs only to us. Kayla's lips parted in a rare, unguarded smile. And I want it to last, she murmured, barely a whisper. As their days wove together, they developed small routines that gave a gentle rhythm to their lives. Evenings became their sanctuary, a time they spent talking about everything from the minute cultural details of Zerechian life to the traditions Eli missed back on Earth. They would prepare food together, and Kayla took delight in the strangely inefficient yet comforting dishes Eli insisted on making. She had quickly grown fond of a particular Earth treat he prepared: soft bread dipped in a blend of spices and herbs. While she found it utterly impractical, she savored each bite with relish, drawn to the way its flavors filled her senses in a way she couldn't explain. Late at night, under the twin moons of Zerich 3, they would sit side by side on the balcony of Kayla's quarters, wrapped in silence but filled with unspoken understanding. Kayla, in these quiet moments, would open up in a way she never had before. She spoke of the fears she harbored, the worries that her society's values might one day try to pull her back. Yet Eli's presence offered her a new courage, a sense of resilience she never knew she possessed. It's strange, Eli, she said one night, her voice barely more than a breath, to think that I was taught to push away these connections, to see them as distractions, and yet with you, I feel as though I am truly alive. Eli reached out, brushing a lock of her shimmering silver hair from her face. Kayla, you don't have to hold back with me. This is real. Whatever comes, we're facing it together. She tilted her head into his hand, her eyes slipping shut as she felt the warmth of his touch seep into her very being. For the first time, she allowed herself to fully embrace the vulnerability, letting it wrap around her heart and settle deeply within her. Their new life wasn't without its moments of tension, of course. Rumors had begun circulating about Kayla's uncharacteristic behavior, whispers that hinted at her softened demeanor and the fact that she was spending so much time with the human researcher. Yet the more Kayla felt the pull of her people's expectations, the more resolute she became. She no longer wanted to fit into the mold she had been given. Instead, she wanted to forge her own path, one built on choices made from her own heart. One morning, as the sun rose over the luminescent landscapes, Kayla and Eli walked hand in hand toward the research center where they both worked. They knew that their relationship was now beyond mere friendship, but they took comfort in the quiet understanding they shared, the unspoken promises held in each touch, each glance. Before they entered the building, Kayla stopped, pulling Eli gently to face her. Her voice, low but filled with quiet strength, held a promise. Whatever challenges await, know that you have given me something my world never could. This bond. It's the start of something neither of us could have foreseen. And for that, Eli, I am grateful beyond words. Eli smiled, his hand reaching up to hold hers. Kayla, our journey is only beginning. I'll be here for whatever comes next. In that moment, as they stood in the soft morning light, they knew that their love was something rare and beautiful, a union of two worlds, two hearts that had found strength in each other. And though the path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges they had yet to face, Eli and Kayla knew that this was more than an adventure. It was truly the beginning of a life they would build together.